Today we're privileged to welcome Pravrajika Shuddhatmaprana, a senior nun of the Ramakrishna Order and longtime resident of the Vivekananda Retreat, Ridgely. She will speak on the subject of self-surrender, easy or difficult. Masterji.
Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavai Tejasvinavaditamastu Ma Vidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. According to Sri Ramakrishna, two things are necessary for the realization of God: faith and self-surrender. Most of us understand something about what faith means, but do we really understand what self-surrender means? I came upon this quote from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna recently at the same time as I was also reading a beautiful book by Father Francis Clooney. The book is called Beyond Compare. It is a comparative reflection on two texts on loving self-surrender to God. One, a Christian text, Treatise on the Love of God by St. Francis de Sales, and the other, a Hindu text, The Essence of the Three Auspicious Mysteries by Sri Vedanta Deshika. When I first opened Father Clooney's book, my eyes fell on a prayer by St. Francis Loyola. Take, Lord, into your possession my complete freedom of action, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All that I have, all that I own, it is your gift to me. I now return it to you. It is all yours to be used simply as you wish. Give me your love and your grace. It is all I need. Well, this is easy to say, I thought. But is it that simple? And what does it really mean? I then remembered the story of the weaver in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. It so perfectly illustrates, I think, the surrender mentioned here. Can we really surrender our entire will like that, as the weaver did? We are so used to thinking that these things are in our control, and we want them to be in our control. We feel proud if they're in our control. Can we really offer them like that? Then I turned a couple of pages in the book, and my eyes fell on the words, so easy and simple, referring to the process of surrendering oneself to God in the Sri Vaishnava tradition in India. Well, there are not two separate gods here, one who demands a heavy tax with one's surrender and the other who wants nothing. So there must be some way to reconcile these two ideas of self-surrender. Perhaps what we're looking at are two different stages. Now let's look at the story of the weaver that Ramakrishna gives in the Gospel. Many of you know it already. This is a story of a man who truly had surrendered his entire will, his freedom of action, and his understanding. He was a fully surrendered man. Let's see how easy this is. Well, the weaver was a village man who sold his clothes he made in the market. He was very pious, and everyone loved him and trusted him. As Sri Ramakrishna said, when a customer asked him the price of a piece of cloth, the weaver would say, by the will of Rama, the price of the yarn is 1 rupee, and the labor 4 annas. By the will of Rama, the profit is 2 annas. So the price of the cloth by the will of Rama is 1 rupee and 6 annas. Such was the people's faith in the weaver that the customer would at once pay the price and take the cloth. Now the weaver was a real devotee of God. And late one night, the weaver couldn't get to sleep. He was sitting in the worship hall smoking now and then when a band of robbers happened to come that way, and they wanted a man to carry their goods. So they said to the weaver, "Come with us." So saying, they dragged him off by the hand. After committing a robbery in the house, they put a load of things on the weaver's head and commanded him to carry them. Then suddenly the police arrived and the robbers ran away. But the weaver with his load was arrested. He was kept in the lockup for the night, and the next day he was brought before the magistrate for trial. The villagers had learned what had happened and came to the court. They said to the magistrate, "Your Honor, this man could never commit a robbery." Thereupon the magistrate asked the weaver to make his statement. The weaver said, "Your Honor, by the will of Rama, I finished my meal at night. Then by the will of Rama, I was sitting in the worship hall. It was quite late at night by the will of Rama. And by the will of Rama, I had been thinking of God and chanting his name and glories, when by the will of Rama, a band of robbers passed that way. By the will of Rama, they dragged me with them. By the will of Rama, they committed a robbery. And by the will of Rama, they put a load on my head. Just then, by the will of Rama, the police arrived, and by the will of Rama, I was arrested. Then, by the will of Rama, the police kept me in the lockup for the night, and this morning, by the will of Rama, I have been brought before your honor." So the magistrate realized that the weaver was a pious man and ordered his release. On his way home, the weaver said to his friends, "By the will of Rama, I have been released." Well, it sounds easy, so easy and simple. The weaver sounds like such a simple soul. There is no calculation in his mind at all. For him, the simple fact is everything happens by the will of Rama, and he accepts everything. So what is the difficulty here? Well, the difficulty for us is, how do we get to this simple state? How do we stop all our preconceptions, fears, and desires for our own welfare? How do we let go? And would we want to let go as the weaver did? This is truly surrendering our will and actions and understanding, as St. Ignatius Loyola prayed for. Now let's take a look at another story. This is from the Bhagavata Purana. The story of an elephant named Gajendra. This story brings up some interesting points, and I think it can give us some clues. In fact, I believe it is actually an allegory of self-surrender. The story goes, in the valley of a great mountain named Trikut, there was a beautiful garden named Rituman that belonged to the god of water, Varuna. And in the midst of that garden was a lake filled with blooming lotuses. One day, Gajendra, the king of a herd of elephants, was feeling scorched by the heat and went there to bathe along with his herd of elephants. Before he could get out of the lake, however, one of his legs was caught in the grip of the jaws of a huge alligator. And after many attempts by the other elephants to save him, he realized that only the Lord could save him. So out of fear of death, he then began to sing a hymn to the Lord, surrendering himself. Though his original intention in his prayer was to get free from the grip of the alligator, in the final part of his prayer, Gajendra asks not for freedom from the jaws of the alligator, but for freedom from ignorance that separates him from the Lord. At this point, Lord Vishnu rushes to Gajendra and frees him from the alligator, and after giving him a divine form, takes him to his heavenly abode of Vaikuntha to be one of his attendants. The alligator, too, was released from his animal farm by Vishnu, and he resumed his previous farm as a Gandharva, a celestial musician. Now, this is one of those beautiful stories we find in Hindu mythology. We don't have to take it literally. Whether it was intended to be an allegory or not, I don't know, but it seems to work. So let's look at it a little more closely. Okay, there is a garden with a lake called Rituman. Rituman means full of life. This represents life in this world. Gajendra, an elephant, represents the individual self with a strong ego. Now, a strong ego is not necessarily bad. Here, Gajendra is portrayed as a very good soul. Yet, any ego is vulnerable, particularly a strong ego. And what does Ramakrishna say the alligator represents? The 6 passions: lust or desire, anger, jealousy, fear, pride, and hatred. Now, when the ego is strong, it is extremely vulnerable to an attack by any or all of the passions, as they are very much interrelated. Then we are in danger of being pulled down in this world and being drowned. So let's take a brief look at these alligator passions to see exactly what they do and how they work on the ego. The head of the alligator, I would say, is lust or desire. It's not only lust, but it is also desire for anything in this world. This is what grabs us first, and if we let it, it will devour us. So desire is the root passion, and all the other passions follow it. Have you ever noticed how quickly you can get obsessed by something you desire? Your mind, like an iPhone or something, your mind starts to dwell on it, and then it cannot let that object go until you do something to possess it. The mind wants to possess it as if it were going to devour it, or as if we were devoured by it. Now, just opposite the alligator's head is the tail. And here, the tail represents anger. This is because anger is the opposite side of the coin from desire. For when we cannot possess something that we desire, we get angry. And whoever or whatever stands in our way of possessing what we desire, we get angry with. It may not be an object at all that we desire. Perhaps it is something intangible, like name and fame. And we mistakenly think that someone or something is standing in our way to it. Whatever it is, we perceive that our desire is thwarted, so we get angry. There's a story of there's 2 attendants of a Sri Vaishnava teacher, Nanjiar, were good friends. But it so happened that they once got into an argument and were very angry with one another, and so much so that they weren't even speaking to each other. So finally, Nanjiar got annoyed with this and scolded them, saying, "Aren't wealth and pleasure to be given up? Isn't the topic of the Lord sufficient? Aren't we to reject the idea of 2 Sri Vaishnavas not speaking to one another?" In other words, a true devotee should not have any other desire than to speak and reflect on the Lord. What other desire should there be? So how should anger even arise? So with this scolding, the 2 disciples immediately became reconciled. Closely related to anger is jealousy. This is one of the alligator's front feet that moves our passions forward. We want to possess something, and we see that someone else has it, or we imagine that someone else has it. Maybe it is an object, or maybe it is, again, something intangible, like name and fame. Jealousy is probably the strangest of the emotions. Really, there is no excuse for it at all. The mind does not work in a rational way at all. If someone else possesses something, that does not mean that we cannot possess it too. But somehow the mind does not work, does not perceive things that way, and we become blind. Then directly opposite to the alligator's foot of jealousy is the foot of hatred. Here again, there is no reasoning process connected with this emotion. It has been shown many times that our bubble of hatred can be easily popped by just a little reasoning. All we have to do is see how that person, the object of our hatred, is just another human being like us with the same desires and hopes. Nanjiar, a Sri Vaishnava teacher, once said, "We can be sure that we have a relationship with the Lord if the misfortune of someone is unbearable to us. But if, when seeing that person's misfortune, we think, oh, that person deserved it, then we can be sure that we have no relationship with the Lord." One of the most beautiful examples, I think, of renouncing hatred and anger is the story of Sita's forgiveness given in the Valmiki Ramayana. When Ravana had been killed and the war that had raged to rescue Sita was over, Hanuman asked Sita's permission to kill the demon women who had been guarding and tormenting her. But Sita refused on the grounds that they had been only following the orders of their master. Then she said, "A noble person does not take into account the sin of those who have committed an offense against her. The vow of not returning evil for evil must be redeemed at all costs. For the virtuous account good conduct as their ornament. Compassion should be shown by a noble soul towards sinners as well as towards the good, nay, even for those deserving death, for there is none who has never committed a wrong." Then behind the alligator's foot of hatred is the foot of fear. Fear comes to us when we are afraid of losing something. So this is how it's connected with desire also. Again, it may be a physical object, or it may be something intangible, or a person, or it may be our health. Fear also is not always rational. Our mind often anticipates something that may not even happen, and we become irrational with anxiety for nothing. Our primal fear, of course, is the fear of death. Referring to people's anxiety about death, Ramanuja's disciple Embar once said, "If the cause is finished, won't the effect also come to an end by itself? Isn't the goal then at hand? So how can there be any cause for anxiety?" That is to say, what he was talking about is, in old age, the causes and conditions that have given rise to the body are coming to an end. Thus, if we have lived our life properly and are devoted to the Lord, then we are coming close to our goal, which is union with the Lord. What is there to fear then? Finally, opposite to the foot of fear is the foot of pride. Pride is probably the most stupid of the emotions. It is trying to contain and preserve our ego in a cast iron case. We love our ego so much and are so identified with a certain image of it that we cannot see that there is anything wrong with it, and we cannot stand the least criticism of it. This is also true for the inflated ego that identifies itself with a certain group or country or race. Pride is like holding a big sign around our neck saying, "Lord, keep out. I don't need you. I am here." Ramakrishna also gave the example of the man in charge of a storeroom. Suppose, he said, in a family, a man has taken charge of the storeroom. Then if someone asks the master, "Sir, will you yourself kindly give me something from the storeroom?" The master says to him, "There's already someone in the storeroom. What can I do there?" So now we can see that all of these emotions depend on the ego, and this is why the alligator has such a strong grip. Without desire for something, the ego cannot function. Then with desire comes everything else, all the other passions. All of these emotions separate us from others and make our life miserable. Instead of expanding our heart, they contract it and make us think only of ourselves. Moreover, they also make us forget God and who we are in relation to God. We think we are the body and mind, and we forget our higher self. We, in fact, identify our lower self as the master of our lives and have no use for the Lord. In fact, to think that one's own self is autonomous and therefore something other than what it is referred to in the Mahabharata as theft of the soul. And this is the case whether we follow the path of knowledge or the path of devotion. Either way, if we willingly allow the animal passions to retain their hold on us, this is the same as holding our lower self to be autonomous. We have lost sight of our true nature. After all, it is not some ghost we are surrendering our will and understanding and other things to. It is our own higher self. In fact, we basically have only two choices here. We either surrender ourselves to our ego and our passions, or we surrender ourselves to the Lord, our higher self. Either one or the other. But somehow, when we surrender ourselves to our ego and passions, it does not seem like we have lost control. Yet it is just the opposite. We can see this every day in our own actions. This is why the poet Namovar says in his verse of surrender to the Lord, "With no place else to go, Lord, I surrender myself at your feet." In other words, there is no other refuge for me, no other option for me, unless I want to drown in this world. So I am surrendering myself to you alone. So if we surrender ourselves to our passions, we remain in the realm of Maya. But if we surrender our ego to the Lord, we get taken across the realm of Maya. As Krishna says in the Gita, this divine Maya of mine, which is constituted by the gunas, is difficult to cross over. Those who take refuge in me alone cross over this Maya. And the commentator Madhusudana Saraswati adds, they cross over easily. So whether one follows the path of knowledge or the path of devotion, the same principles apply here. Whatever path one follows, one needs faith and self-surrender. It is simply not possible to rely on one's ego and at the same time surrender to the higher self. So the idea in surrender is to continually place the higher self, or God, first, and negate the lower self with its passions. And how is this done? By simply turning the mind to God. It's as simple as that. And this we see in the story of Gajendra. Here, at the beginning of this story, Gajendra thinks he is an elephant, the king of the elephants, in fact. He identifies himself with his body and ego. When he enters the lake of the world, that is all he knows. Now, suppose, like Gajendra, we have our wits about us when we are attacked by the alligator passions, and we recognize there is danger. Then this strong elephant ego immediately thinks, oh, I will fight this alligator off, no problem. But if we don't have our wits about us, we will quickly be dragged down and drowned. But Gajendra is a sincere soul, a struggling soul. He recognizes the danger and does not want to be drowned. Now, the other elephants who rush to our aid, these are our virtues and good qualities. They immediately, even without being asked, come to rescue us and try to save us. Then there's a standoff. Who is stronger? Now, the Bhagavata makes an interesting point here. Gajendra begins to lose his strength in this battle, but the elephant gains strength. This is because life in this world, that is, the lake, is the alligator's real home. The passions need this world of dual experience. They thrive in it, whereas Gajendra's real nature is divine, though he doesn't know it. So he loses strength as he is pulled down into the world. Then finally the soul says, even my friends, my virtues, are not helping me. Now only the Lord can help me. So the soul recognizes that it is not as powerful as it thought. It cannot remove the danger by itself, even with the help of its friends. It needs the Lord, the higher self. The ego is now a little less strong, but it is still there. But now it turns to the Lord. It says, Lord, I need help. I desperately want to be saved, and only you can save me. So the Lord thinks he's finally beginning to recognize where the real source of his strength is, but not fully. I'll wait. He needs to fully surrender to me, not for his sake, but for me alone. Now, if our elephant ego is fortunate by constantly thinking of God, praying to God for his grace, then it will develop more and more love for God and be melted by that love. Now, what does melted by love for God mean? When something melts, it dissolves. In this case, as the mind contemplates on God, the barriers that the ego puts up around our self dissolve. Then the self begins to melt into God. Now, contrasting the obstinate soul, which cannot receive God, with a gentle heart that is open to the Lord, St. Francis de Sales wrote, and when the soul is fixed upon her own inclinations and wills, we say she is hard, that is, opinionated, obstinate. We call that a heart of iron or wood or stone, which does not easily receive the divine impressions, but dwells in its own will. By contrast, a gentle, pliable, and tractable heart is termed a melting and liquefied heart. And what does melted mean, save that it is no longer contained within itself, but has flowed out towards its divine lover? The poet Saint Periyalvar also described this state of melting in one of his beautiful poems. Referring to Lord Vishnu, he says, I have opened the mouth of my melting body, swallowed you up, and filled myself with you. Actually, if we meditate on this verse, we should find that it says everything. So finally, the soul starts melting and realizes that it does not need or want anything else but the Lord. When the Lord sees this, then he comes to the rescue. In fact, the Bhagavatam says the Lord rushed to Gajendra's side to rescue him. But the Lord did not rescue him in the sense that we often assume. He did not rescue him from the alligator to return him to his life as the king of elephants. Rather, he gave him eternal life with himself. By rescue, the Lord meant that he gave himself. As Krishna says in the Gita, to them who are ever devoted and worship me with love, I grant that possession of wisdom by which they attain me. Out of compassion for them alone, I, residing in their hearts, destroy the darkness born of ignorance with the luminous lamp of knowledge. So this is how our intellect, our will, our memory, all become directed by God. They melt into God and are illumined by the Lord. The control we thought we had through our emotions is gone, and the Lord, or the higher self, takes charge. It is all done by filling our mind with God. Again, we should remember the Lord does not necessarily rescue us in the way that we might have in mind. He may have other ideas, and this is part of the surrender, letting go of preconceived notions of how things ought to be and letting go of our own will. So the story of Gajendra is the story of a struggling soul. He genuinely loves God and does not want to be drowned in this world. We see in this brief story how he gradually learns to let go, giving up, as St. Ignatius Loyola says, his will, understanding, and memory. Then God's grace comes and the memory of his real nature comes. He understands who he really is. Now, let's look at how this process of self-surrender worked in the life of another soul, a disciple of Ramakrishna named Girish Ghosh. Girish, it seems, got lured, or you might even say tricked, by Ramakrishna into surrendering himself. Ramakrishna recognized that Girish, like Gajendra, was a sincere but a struggling soul, and he knew that self-surrender was the best path for him. He also knew that Girish would make a wonderful exemplar of how surrender works in one's life. As most of you know, Girish was an actor and an extremely gifted playwright, a genius, you might say. He also lived a rather unorthodox lifestyle, drinking and carousing, and he did not care what anyone thought about him. But he was sincere to the backbone and also had genuine faith in God. So these two qualities saved him. One day, when he came to see Ramakrishna, Girish surrendered himself to the master and asked, "Sir, what shall I do now?" This was what Girish thought of as surrender. Like Gajendra's first prayer when he was afraid of death. Yes, it was surrender. Girish was obviously sincere, but actually this was more like setting him on the path of surrender. As Girish quickly discovered, he was not, at that point anyway, fully prepared to surrender his will, his desires, and actions. The master then told him to continue what he was doing, but that he should think of God every morning and evening. Well, this sounded easy enough. But Girish hesitated. Remember, he was totally sincere. He did not want to break any promise that he made to the master. So he began thinking of his life and how he did not have any fixed routine, and he thought this would be a very difficult promise to keep. He did not know where he would be or what he would be doing from in the mornings and evenings from one day to the next. He could not honestly say yes, but again, he was ashamed to say he could not do such a simple thing. And here he thought he had surrendered to himself. Well, the master understood Girish's predicament from his silence and made another suggestion. Just remember the Lord before you eat and sleep. But again, Girish hesitated. He never knew when he would be able to sleep or sit down for a meal, and while he was eating, his mind would always be preoccupied with various problems and worries. How could he remember the Lord then? Besides this, just the idea of being bound by a commitment made him feel claustrophobic. Again, he was silent. Well, Ramakrishna smiled and said, "So, you are unwilling to agree even to this. All right, give me your power of attorney." Saying this, Ramakrishna went into an ecstatic state. Well, Girish was overjoyed and willingly agreed to this surrender. Now he felt that he was free from all obligations, and the master loved him and would take care of him here and hereafter. It was so easy. He did not have to do a thing. So why not surrender his power of attorney? Swami Sarvapriyananda wrote, "At that time, Girish did not realize that he had willingly put a noose of love around his own neck that was 100 times stronger than the bondage of rules which he considered unbearable." But Girish was now reassured. While he was eating, lying down, or sitting, he had only one thought: Sri Ramakrishna has taken full responsibility for me. He could not realize that this thought was constantly making his mind meditate on Sri Ramakrishna and putting the Master's impression on his every action and thought, changing him radically. Girish was simply happy because he knew that Sri Ramakrishna loved him and that he was more than his own. In other words, Girish's mind was now starting to melt with love for Ramakrishna. Swami Sarvapriyananda continued, knowing of Girish's new attitude of self-surrender, the Master began to train him with this in mind. One day, while in the Master's presence, Girish said, "I shall do this, regarding a trifling matter." But immediately the Master said, "What is this? You must not talk in that way. Suppose you fail to do it. Say, 'I shall do this if God wills.'" Girish immediately understood. That's right. When I have given all of my responsibilities to God and He has accepted them, I shall be able to do that only if He thinks that I should and if it is good for me. So henceforward, Girish began to shun the idea of egoistic things and expressions as "I shall do this and I shall go there," and so on. So now Girish was beginning to understand what real self-surrender was. Again, Swami Sarvapriyananda wrote, "Thus the days rolled on, the Master passed away, and Girish faced grief and pain as he also lost his wife and son. But at every point, his mind reminded him, as before, Sri Ramakrishna has allowed these things to happen to you because they are good for you. You have given him your responsibility to him, and he has accepted it. He did not give you any written assurance regarding the path on which he would lead you. Now he is leading you along this path, considering it to be easy for you. You have no reason to refuse it or to complain. Did you make an empty promise when you gave him the power of attorney and transferred your responsibility to him?" So we see, if the ego is strong and tries to resist, tries to move in its own way, then self-surrender is difficult. Though Girish had a strong elephant ego and had all along before been stubborn and willful, his mind was quickly melting through the power of his faith and surrender. As Girish later said, "Did I realize then that there was so much mystery in the power of attorney? Now I see that there is a limit to the time one must spend in practicing meditation, japa, and austerities. But the work of a person who has given the power of attorney is unending. Now he has to watch at every step and with every breath determine whether he is depending on God in performing those actions by his will or by the power of his own rascal ego." Moreover, if we think we can surrender to God yet continue to live our life with our same old habits, that is, if our life has not been transformed by this surrender and we are still ruled by our alligator passions, then, as Swami Sarvapriyananda says, it is doubtful that we have truly surrendered. And it is equally doubtful that God has accepted that surrender. Swami Sarvapriyananda said, "But if you truly give the power of attorney, the feeling of God's infinite compassion will constantly rise within the deepest recesses of your heart. You will feel as if you had been drowning in the ocean of worldliness, and that now God in his mercy has rescued you. When you experience that, just imagine how much your love and devotion for him will flow. Your heart will be filled with love and gratitude. You will constantly think of him and repeat his name, and you will not need anyone to remind you to do so." So this is exactly what happened to Girish. Like Gajendra, Girish's heart simply melted with love of God. This is how surrender transforms a person. Now, what becomes apparent here in the story of Girish, but is not quite so apparent in the stories of the weaver and of Gajendra, is that self-surrender is more of a process. Yes, one might make a commitment of self-surrender, as Girish did, at a certain point in time. And as Ramakrishna says, it is necessary to make this commitment. In the Sri Vaishnava tradition in South India, in fact, it is an act that one makes at a certain point in one's sadhana. And this act requires a certain amount of faith. But as one's faith grows, one's self-surrender also becomes more established, more firm in one's life. But the real surrender comes when there is a complete change of heart. We then start living in surrender, as Girish did and the weaver did. And this surrender is easy because it comes from our basic nature, our basic instinct. It comes naturally when we understand who we are and what we are in relation to God or to our higher self. Moreover, one's faith grows when one sees the hand of God in everything. This is not necessarily understood at the beginning, that is, when an act of surrender is first made. But when this understanding comes, we realize that God is not only the goal, but is also the means. What was it that the weaver saw? He saw that everything happens by the will of Rama. He saw that it is God who does everything. And according to Ramakrishna, this realization comes after surrender. In one of Namavar's verses, he says, "My food and drink, everything I need, are all my Krishna." So when the Lord becomes everything for us, the food we eat, the water we drink, and so forth, as he did for Namavar, then we are firmly established in self-surrender. Once someone asked a man, "Tell me a way to think of our Lord." And the other man replied, "I will tell you that if you can tell me a way to forget him." Now, commenting on this, the Sri Vaishnava teacher Nam Pillai said, "For nothing apart from the Lord has substance or name without him. Whenever anything appears, it manifests the Lord first." That is to say, when we are established in true surrender to God, then we see God everywhere and in everything. Then we acquire eyes of love. Swami Brahmananda also said, "Surrender yourself fully to the Lord. There is nothing but him. Verily, all this is Brahman. He is all in all, and everything belongs to him. Never calculate. Is it possible to surrender oneself in a day? When surrender is achieved, everything is over. One should struggle hard for self-surrender." According to Pilalokacharya, a Sri Vaishnava teacher, true surrender to the Lord is a special form of understanding. He calls it buddhi vishesha. It's a particular way of thinking, a particular mental mode, which, among other things, brings the realization that one is dependent on none else but the Lord, and that the Lord alone is our protector. This understanding, he says, consists of firm faith. Again, according to him, one then understands it is very easy to do. Now, from the devotee's side, this is the attitude of mind of one who truly takes refuge in the Lord. Faith is key here. It is simple and easy to do, yes, but the mind must be ready for it. Actually, I believe Girish's real surrender took place when he accepted the master's scolding. "You must not talk in that way. Say, 'I shall do this if God wills.'" Girish's mind was then ready. He understood the real nature of surrender then, and he accepted it. This was when the buddhi vishesha, the real mental mode of surrender, was set in his mind. But what about from the Lord's side? Is there nothing that he does? As we see in Ramakrishna's life, he also made a commitment. When Girish agreed to give Ramakrishna the power of attorney, Ramakrishna willingly accepted it, and Girish also had faith that his surrender was accepted. Regarding this, we can look at another story from the Ramayana and also see how this story, this incident, is understood in the Sri Vaishnava tradition. The story goes, after the demon king Ravana had kidnapped Rama's wife, Sita, Ravana's younger brother, Vibhishana, tried to reason with him in every way to return Sita. Ravana, however, refused to listen, and actually he abused his younger brother very much and treated him like a traitor, even though he was his well-wisher. So for this reason, Vibhishana finally left his family and country and went to Rama's camp to seek refuge with him. Now, this was a dangerous thing to do. He knew he could be killed because Rama's allies would naturally be suspicious of him. Yet Vibhishana had firm faith that Rama was not an ordinary person. Well, just as Vibhishana feared, Rama's followers, such as Sugriva, were very suspicious of him. They thought he must actually be Ravana's spy, or that he would try to kill them all when their guard was down. So they went to Rama, and most of them advised him not to give shelter to Vibhishana. Rama listened to all the arguments and finally shared with them his own thoughts. He said, I cannot refuse to receive, under any circumstances, him who has come to me in a friendly spirit. Even if there is any wickedness in him, his acceptance is not reprehensible in the eyes of good people. I vouchsafe security against all living beings to him who comes to me only once and seeks protection from me, saying, I am yours. Such is my vow. Bring Vibhishana here, O jewel of monkeys. Be he Vibhishana or Ravana himself, O Sugriva. Security has already been granted in his favor by me. Now, explaining these verses, Nampalai says that once we have in faith confided our self-will unto the keeping of God, as Vibhishana did to Lord Rama, or as Girish did to Ramakrishna, this act itself has spiritual power sufficient to safely carry us on to the very acme of spiritual eminence. Nothing needs to be done on our side, for God, our refuge, takes up the work of our salvation after our surrender, for such is his perfection, glory, and grace, on which we have but to implicitly rely. So once that mental mode of surrender comes and we accept it and act on it, then the Lord does the rest, whatever is needed. Ramakrishna also said, surrender yourself to God and you will achieve everything. Then, as Nampalai says, the Lord himself takes up the work of our salvation. Again, the key word here is faith. Faith at the time of surrendering and continued faith after our surrender. Then the Lord himself fills our mind with love and gratitude, so much so that we cannot forget him. We melt into him. For us, it all begins with faith. This is beautifully illustrated in Girish's life. Faith is what Girish started with. He had tremendous faith in Ramakrishna, and in spite of all the sufferings that he endured in his life, he never wavered from that faith and surrender. His total reliance on his act of surrender, his total reliance on God, changed him radically, as Swami Sarvapriyananda said. Girish called it a mystery, And it is a mystery because it all comes from God. Now, we speak of this self-surrender in dualistic terms, but it is not dualistic at all. As we said before, God is our own higher self. He's not some ghost that we surrender to. There's a very beautiful metaphor of this given in the Ramayana written by the Tamil poet Kamban. There, Rama is compared to the breath of life, while Sita is said to be the containing body. When Rama discovers that Sita is missing from their forest hut, he runs all over the forest in search of her, as Kamban says, like the breath of life that has been separated from its containing body. But what seems to be here two separate living beings, that is, Rama and Sita, are in actuality one. Here also, Kamban uses Sita as the paradigmatic devotee, so it is really the devotee that is compared to the containing body, while God is like the life breath in the body. Thus, dependence on God, who is like the breath of our life, is completely natural for the soul, as God and the soul are one. Parasarabhatta also described it like this. The devotee says to the Lord, Narayana, you are nothing without me, and I am nothing without you. And the Lord replies, if I exist, then you exist. If I do not exist, then you do not exist. It's a mystery. We look at the story of Gajendra and we look at Girish's life only from the standpoint of their struggles. We don't know what it is that the Lord does when he saves a sincere, struggling soul. In the final analysis regarding matters of the spirit, reasoning is of no use after a certain point. We simply have to have faith in God's existence and faith in his grace. We could go on and on analyzing and dissecting all the different stages and components of these spiritual disciplines, but this won't give us an answer as to how we attain God's grace or God realization. In spiritual matters, we must remember the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. We can never get all the answers. At a certain point, we must rely on faith and surrender ourselves to the divine. Thank you.